It begins with footsteps. Footsteps in snow that should have been untouched, in a place so remote that the sound of boots on frozen ground carried farther than voices. They led toward the lonely farmhouse of Hinterkaifeck in Bavaria, clear, deliberate prints stretching from the edge of the forest. And yet, there were no prints leading back. Within days, every living soul in that farmhouse would be gone. 6 people, including a young girl, just 2 years old, were found brutally murdered with a mattock, a heavy farming tool. Their bodies lay hidden in hay, their faces crushed, their lives ended with a violence that spoke of rage and something darker. And here's what makes it worse. In the days after the killings, smoke curled from the farmhouse chimney. The cattle were fed, the dog was cared for, and neighbors swore they saw faint movement inside. Whoever had done this had stayed. Hinterkaifeck wasn't the kind of place you stumbled upon. It was a small farmstead about 70 kilometers north of Munich, set deep in the Bavarian countryside. The land stretched in long, uneven lines of soil and pasture, bordered by thick forest. The closest neighbors were a walk away, not impossible in an emergency, but far enough to make the farm feel like its own world. In March 1922, the Gruber family lived there. Andreas, 63, stern-faced and broad-shouldered even with age. His wife, Kazilia, 72, quieter but with a sharpness in her eyes that suggested she missed little. Their widowed daughter Victoria Gabriel, 35, strong-willed and known for singing in the church choir. Victoria's 2 children, Kazilia, 7, bright and talkative, and Joseph, just 2 years old, and the family's maid, Maria Baumgartner, who had only just started working there. It was a working farm in the truest sense. The air was full of the smell of hay and livestock, and every surface bore the marks of use. Wooden beams darkened with age, iron tools polished to a dull sheen by decades of work. The house itself was solid, with thick walls to keep out the cold and small, high windows that let in light but kept the winter winds at bay. But in the last days of March, a shadow passed over the quiet routine. Andreas Gruber noticed something strange. Deep footprints in the snow, starting at the edge of the forest and ending right at the farmhouse. No return prints. He searched the property, but found no intruder. Later, he discovered that the house key had gone missing. Doors were heard opening in the night. An unfamiliar newspaper was found in the kitchen. Strange noises came from the attic, but when Andreas searched it, he found nothing. He told his neighbors about these things, half laughing it off, but there was unease in his voice. This suggested he contact the police, but Andreas waved them off. The Grubers were private people, and besides, who would travel miles into the woods just to haunt a farmhouse without taking anything? Spring was coming, but the cold still clung to the nights. The snow was patchy now, melting in the fields, the ground softening under the weight of the season's first rains. And at Hinterkaifeck, something unseen had already crossed the threshold. The last days of March 1922 passed with a kind of stillness that felt heavy, like the air before a storm. At Hinterkaifeck, the small oddities Andreas Gruber had noticed were still fresh in his mind. He mentioned them again to his neighbors. The strange footprints, the missing key, the noises in the attic, but he spoke of them as curiosities, not dangers. Perhaps that was his way of keeping fear from taking root. On March 30th, the day before the killings, the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, arrived. She was 44, modest and shy, and it was her first day working for the family. She had taken the position reluctantly. Her sister had walked her to the farm, and when they arrived, she admitted she felt uneasy about the place. The sister would later say she had a bad feeling when she left Maria there that afternoon. That same day, young Kazilia, the 7-year-old, told her teacher at school something unsettling. She said her mother, Victoria, had been arguing with her grandfather. Loud, heated words. And the little girl also mentioned that the night before, she had been woken by sounds upstairs, like footsteps. She said she was frightened and wished she could sleep somewhere else. The teacher, accustomed to rural family squabbles, didn't think much of it. Elsewhere in the house, Andreas went about his chores, feeding the animals, repairing a fence, stacking wood for the fire. Victoria tended to Joseph, the toddler, and prepared meals. To any passerby, it would have looked like an ordinary day on an ordinary farm. But inside, each family member carried small fragments of unease, moments they couldn't quite explain, feelings they couldn't quite shake. That evening, after supper, the house fell into its nightly rhythm. The cows were milked, tools cleaned and put away, lamps lit against the encroaching darkness. The wind picked up outside, whispering through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then stopped. No one could have known it was the last time these routines would be completed. By the following night, Hinterkaifeck would be silent, except perhaps for the quiet, steady sound of boots moving through the snow. The evening of March 31st, 1922, fell cold and still over Hinterkaifeck. The sky above Bavaria was a deep, iron gray, the kind that swallows the last of the light quickly, leaving the land in shadow before you've realized it's gone. Inside the farmhouse, lamps flickered against the thick walls, casting long, soft-edged shapes across the floors. Dinner was simple: bread, cheese, and warm milk from the day's milking. Andreas sat at the head of the table, his posture as straight as always, eyes on his plate. Kazilia, the grandmother, moved slowly between the table and the kitchen, her hands wrapped in a cloth against the lingering chill. Victoria fed spoonfuls of food to little Joseph, who laughed when she made the spoon sway like an airplane before it reached his mouth. Young Kazilia sat close to her mother, head bent over her own plate, eyes occasionally drifting toward the darkened windows. Maria, the new maid, moved quietly through it all, still adjusting to her new surroundings. Every so often, she glanced toward the doors, as if making sure they were locked. Perhaps she was still thinking about the bad feeling her sister had confessed to the day before. Outside, the fields lay empty, save for the occasional gust of wind that bent the dry stalks left over from last year's harvest. The forest loomed at the edge of the land, its trees black against the fading light. Somewhere out there, though no one in the farmhouse knew it, boots pressed into the softening snow, deliberate and patient. After supper, the family settled into their routines. The animals were checked and fed for the night. The barn doors bolted, the lamps turned low. A few voices carried through the night air, but soon even those faded, replaced by the steady, living hush of a working farm at rest. It is believed the first to die was Andreas. Perhaps he heard a sound, a knock at the door, a shuffle outside, and stepped out to investigate. In the cold, still dark between house and barn, someone struck him down with a mattock. The blow was heavy, precise, and final. What followed is not recorded in detail, only pieced together from the positions of the bodies when they were found. It seems likely that Kazilia, the grandmother, followed him out, perhaps wondering why he hadn't returned. She too was struck down. Then Victoria, then young Kazilia. Each one, lured or forced into the barn, met the same fate. The little girl's final moments were the most haunting to reconstruct. Evidence suggested she may have survived her first injuries for several hours, even pulling out her own hair in terror before finally succumbing. Back in the house, Maria and Joseph remained. Whether they heard the muffled thuds from the barn is unknown. Perhaps the killer moved quickly. Perhaps the sound of the wind in the eaves masked it. But soon the intruder stepped back inside, where the warm light still pooled on the floors, and finished the work. Maria was struck as she lay in bed in her attic room. Joseph, just 2 years old, was killed in his cot. The house then fell silent. No cries rang out across the fields. No neighbor would know anything was wrong for days. But here's the part that chills even hardened investigators. The killer did not leave. Over the next several days, smoke rose from the farmhouse chimney. The animals in the barn were fed. Bread was baked in the kitchen. Someone ate meals there, moved about the rooms, slept under that roof. And all the while, 6 bodies lay cold, hidden under hay in the barn and under blankets in the house. For 4 days, Hinterkaifeck kept its silence. Silence on Saturday, when the church pew that should have held Victoria and little Kazilia sat empty, the hymns thinner without her alto threading the notes together. Silence on Sunday, when the farm smoke rose in a neat gray ribbon, as if summoned by invisible hands, and then curled away into the trees. Silence on Monday, when the postman left letters in the box and noticed, as postmen do, small deviations from the daily rhythm. The dog didn't meet him at the fence. The curtains in the parlor hadn't been drawn back to let the pale light in. Silence on Tuesday, when the schoolteacher marked a name absent, then frowned because it was not like the girl to miss a day without a note. The fields around the farm were thawing at the edges, the last of the snow shrinking into ragged patches among the furrows. Meltwater traced thin seams through the soil, and the forest kept to its own business, creaking when the wind pressed through. From the road, Hinterkaifeck looked as it always had, low, compact, built like a body that knows how to withstand long winters. A curl of smoke from the kitchen chimney. Manure already spread neatly across a distant line of ground. A cow's low groan at feeding time. And yet, there was a hush that didn't belong to the season, a hush that felt like a hell breath. On the fourth day, a small group of neighbors walked up the rutted track with their shoulders set and their mouths thin. They had come on foot, as people still did when concern tugged at the sleeve more insistently than patience. At the head of the group was a man whose farm lay closest to the Grubers. He had knocked the day before and gotten no answer. Today, he brought two others, the kind of men who could take the measure of a situation without making a lot of noise. They carried nothing more than the tools their lives had already put in their hands: pike pole, a stout walking stick, a stiff leather glove. The dog started them first, a sudden, raw bark from inside the barn that made all three stop, then look at one another. He barked again, a hoarse, frustrated sound, the kind a dog makes when he has something to say and no words to say it. The gate to the yard stood half open, and they felt a small, childish urge to call out from a safe distance, to summon someone to the threshold so that the world could rearrange itself into its ordinary shape again. A man in an apron wiping his hands, a woman with a dishcloth, a child peeking around a doorframe. No one answered. They tried the front door. Locked. They circled to the kitchen entrance. Locked. At the barn, one of the great doors was stuck, resisting not with a human hand, but with the stubbornness of wood that had swollen with damp. They heaved it open inch by inch, and the smells of animal heat and hay and old iron drifted over them, ordinary and out of place all at once. The dog's barks came in a quick rhythm now. He was tethered, they saw, tied in a line at the far end of the passageway, his eyes hot with agitation, a fresh welt under one brow. The rope was just long enough that he could not get to them, and maybe that was what saved their legs from his fear. Dogs, like people, don't always know where to lay their terror down. There is a particular stillness inside a barn in early spring. The cattle turn their slow, heavy heads when you enter, and their breath clouds the air in brief, ghostly plumes. Chickens, when they are unsettled, fall into an eerie quiet, as if waiting for a cue only they can hear. One of the men clucked his tongue about the place being well tended, fresh straw under the cows, mangers neatly filled, the shovel by the mucking trench free of yesterday's crust. Someone had been here. Someone had fed and watered, swept and arranged. It made the back of the neck itch. The passage opens to the threshing floor, a wide rectangle of packed earth, a place where the rawness of work feels honest and loud when the day is bright. Today it felt like a room that had swallowed its own voice. In the center of that space, half spilled from its neat stack, lay hay that had been forked recently enough to keep its color. One of the men stepped forward, then stopped. He wasn't sure what drew his eye, some slight wrongness in the pattern of the straw, a shape under the slant of it that didn't belong. He raised a hand to hold the others back, and then he reached with the pike pole, not gently but not rough, either, and lifted. There was hair first, not the smear of it you see when animals lie down after grooming, but hair that still insisted on being part of a head. Then the line of a brow, the crushed ruin of a face, and a dark that was neither shadow nor straw. It took the mind a split second to make sense of shapes that the heart had already recognized. He lowered the pole and took a breath he didn't know he had been holding. They uncovered them carefully, even if the first movement had not been delicate. The hay fell away in small avalanches, and then there was the clear, unforgiving geometry of four bodies laid together. Andreas lay nearest the door, broad shoulders shrunken by violence. Beside him, his wife, Kazilia, folded in a way that said she had fallen more slowly, perhaps reaching for someone who wasn't there. Victoria was there too, her features obscured by injury and straw and the careful, insufficient dignity of a blanket that someone had pulled over part of her. And little Kazilia, 7 years old, was pressed so close to her mother that it hurt to look. Later, someone would say that she had lived long enough to pull out clumps of her own hair in fear. Now, the men only saw the scalp where it was bare and felt the deep, simple outrage of that detail, the way it injures a person to imagine a child suffering alone. None of them spoke at first. The floorboards above their heads creaked, and one of the oxen shifted its weight and sighed. The dog stuttered another bark and then quieted, as if recognizing that there was nothing to be gained by insisting. One of the men made a small sign with his forefinger and thumb, a gesture learned at a mother's kitchen table a lifetime ago. Another pulled his cap from his head and held it against his chest. They split then, two to the house, one to stay with the barn to keep away the curious and the foolish. The kitchen door yielded when they pressed harder, a lock not quite latched. Would that gave instead of complained. The room inside was warm in the way that only stone and stove heat can be. The stove itself held a slow belly of embers that still gave off the soft, steady draft of a fire that has been tended regularly. On the table, someone had left the ghost of a meal. Bread heels sliced and then not eaten, a smear of fat like a fingerprint, a plate set too neatly to have been forgotten. A kettle on the trivet held enough heat that one of the men scalded his fingertip when he laid it on the iron to test his own sense of strangeness. They called out again, loud this time, not because they expected answer, but because it felt wrong not to make noise inside a house that had clearly known voices. Nothing returned to them but the murmur of the stove and the sound of their own boots. They found Maria in her attic room, the shape of her under a bed cover. Still, there was the same blunt, flattened wrongness to the top of her head, the same absence of a face where a face should have been. Beside the bed, her small bag, half unpacked, lay open, soap wrapped in paper, a small brush with a worn handle, two hairpins placed side by side as if they had been set down carefully and then never picked up again. Joseph was in the small nursery crib, a shawl thrown over the rail. The hush, there was a deeper thing than quiet. The man who had taken off his cap before lowered himself to one knee and rested his hand lightly on the worn wood of the crib's edge. Later, he would tell his wife that time stopped for a heartbeat there, that he could hear nothing but the sound of the house itself breathing, as if it refused to let him leave without reckoning with the fact of what he had seen. By the time word reached the nearest authorities, feet had already begun to gather. Farms empty themselves quickly when news walks the road. People arrive with intentions as mixed as their expressions: grief, curiosity, the need to be useful, the urge to witness. Some came carrying tools out of instinct: shovels, lanterns, hooks. Others brought nothing but their presence, and the cold pressed around them all the same. It will be said later, with the kind of bitterness that comes from learning the lesson too late, that the scene was badly handled, that footprints were trampled, doors opened and closed without thought, bodies moved. But at that first hour, before procedure took hold, human beings did what they always do when faced with the unbearable. They drew nearer, trying to make the world small enough to understand. The first uniformed men arrived with an air of caution lacquered over urgency. They set about the house in wide circles, staying their hands where they could, touching only what they must. One crouched and peered at the lock of the feed-room door. It had the skinned look of metal that has been forced not by fire, but by a tool. Another found a newspaper on the kitchen bench with a masthead from a town no one at Hinterkaifeck bought their papers from. It wasn't torn or singed. It looked as if someone had read it with the patience of a man who is nowhere to be. In the barn loft, above the place where the four bodies had lain, a soldier's tidy instinct found slightly disturbed straw in a narrow lane that led to the gable. The boards up there ran true, and the space was clean in the way tidy men, keep clean places. An empty spot on a beam, just wide enough for a tool, bore the pale shadow where wood had not aged with the rest. Something had rested there long enough to claim a lighter silhouette. In a corner, there was a bit of coarse cord and a small, dark smear on a joist that could have been pitch, could have been old blood. The man squinted at it in the low light, then let his gaze unfocus and listened, a habit from wartime. Listening for what a room says when you stop trying to force it to tell you anything specific. He heard only the wind worrying the thatch, and, far below, the dull clank of a stanchion chain against a post as a cow scratched her neck. Outside, the thaw was keeping its schedule. Meltwater lapped at the edge of the yard where carts usually slept. A young constable, cheeks chapped red by the wind, walked the perimeter with his hands jammed under his arms and found, near the line where the forest began, the faint remnants of prints. The edges of them had gone soft with sun, the flat ovals turning into shapes that needed interpretation. Even so, he could tell they came from the woods rather than from any of the tracks leading in from the road. He walked their ghost back toward the house, then lost them under a patch where snow had given up and left only wet earth behind. He squatted, stared at the ground like it might change its mind and show him more, then stood and called to the others. By late afternoon, the yard had taken on the look of a place that belongs to no one and everyone at once. A wagon stood at an angle, its shafts propped like a pair of sticks against the sky. Coffee came in thick cups, and someone passed a loaf of bread along a line of hands without any of them realizing how strange, how wrong. It was to eat where bread had been baked just days ago by hands that would never hold a cup again. The sun slid behind a bank of cloud, and the cold crept back in, reminding everyone present that night would come whether they were done or not. The doctor from the district arrived in a coat too thin for the wind, and set his bag on the kitchen table, as if that act alone could anchor reason inside the house. He saw the stove, the neatness of plates, the rag folded over the sink's edge, and pressed his lips together before he stepped into the hall that led to the barn. His hands were steady when he lifted the hay back from faces that were no longer faces. He straightened when he reached the small body of the girl, and the rigid set of grief on his features turned, briefly, into something like anger. Anger not at a person he could name, but at the sin of the act itself, at the refusal of the world to protect a child when it most mattered. He spoke in a low voice to the officer beside him. Blunt force to the head. A tool, heavy, more than one blow in at least 2 cases. The older man, crushing injuries to the skull. The woman, similar. The girl, he stopped, then continued. She lived after the first blow. The tearing here suggests panic. Hours, perhaps, before she died. The man with the notebook wrote, without looking down, his pen scratching a line of ink that could not hold the weight of the words it captured. By evening, lamps had been brought, and the farmhouse glowed like a lantern set too far back in a cave to do anyone good. The decision was made to move the bodies, first out of mercy for the animals that could sense things that men pretend not to, and second because the barn, with its porous walls and its echoing drafts, felt like an insult to the dead. Boards were laid as temporary stretchers. The men lifted with a care that had more to do with respect than with necessity. These bodies could not feel the jolt of a careless step, but their lives deserved gentleness now when it could not serve them then. Inside, on the kitchen table, piece by careful piece, the doctor did what he could. Notes were taken, measurements made. There is a kind of horror in the specificity of such work, a singular cruelty in the way that detailing edges and angles and fractures is an act of love in disguise. Someone must look closely so that later, when people ask, there's a record that says they were seen all the way to the end. There were no defensive wounds that made sense against the blows. Things had happened too quickly. There were no signs of theft. Money lay in its usual places, jewelry, small and not worth a thief's time, glimmered where it always had. The dog had been tethered, yes, and perhaps struck, though whether before or after the murders no one could be sure. The house had been lived in. That fact pressed on the room from every angle. Night put its shoulder against the windows. Upstairs, a draft hummed an old tune through a crack in the frame. The cowbells knocked dully, a metronome for the ache of the place. And under it all, the thing that would make this crime live long after the lamps were doused and the bodies carried away. The sense that the killer had not hurried. Whoever had done this had known the pace of a day on a farm and had shaped themselves to it, had fed animals and stoked fires, had perhaps stood at the door and watched the weather the way the house's owners always had. The brutality had been sudden. The staying afterward had been steady. That combination, like ice atop deep water, made the ground beneath every man in the room feel treacherous. Toward midnight, the doctor closed his bag. He stood very still for a long moment, as if listening to the house to see if it would say anything now that he had finished speaking to it in the language of measurement and loss. The constable asked him, quiet, whether he could say what kind of tool had been used. A mattock, the doctor said eventually. A farm tool like a pick with a wide blade. Something a hand, something a man could carry without comment. The men looked at one another then, and you could feel the idea, as heavy as a beam, settle on the group. The murderer had not brought the world to Hinterkaifeck. He had used the world as he found it. Before dawn, a priest came and said the old words in the kitchen, words that make their own warmth even when the room is cold. He blessed the table because it had hosted the last ordinary meal, and he blessed the doorways because thresholds remember you when you cross them for the last time. Outside, frost had re-stitched itself across the ruts in the yard, and when the first gray scum bled the eastern sky, the place looked briefly like any other farm waking up, until your eye fell on a certain angle of a door, a certain silence in the stable, a certain curve in the snow where too many feet had gone and not enough had returned. By morning, the road had gossip running on it like a current. Villagers told and retold the fragments. The missing house key, the wrong newspaper, the footprint that came from the trees and not from the road, the dog with the wounded face, the fresh bread and the warm stove. The broom leaned at just the angle Victoria always left it. Proof, said one woman, that a stranger could live in your rooms and still keep the shape of your life intact enough to fool the neighbors. Men who had fought in the trenches and come home thinking they had seen all a man could do to another man shook their heads and sat with their backs to walls for a while. Later, days later, weeks, the authorities would say that the heads of the dead should be sent to the city, that closer examination might tell what the barn could not. There are parts of the story that end up belonging more to legend than to record, and this is one, that those heads were sent away and then lost somewhere in the machinery of another, larger war. Whether or not that is precisely true, the feeling is this case kept losing the things that might have anchored it. Tools vanished. Footprints softened. Paperwork was misfiled. Names were spoken in one room and then denied in the next. The crime began to belong not just to the farm, but to the country around it. A mirror people walked past and glanced into and then looked away. What the neighbors did not know as they began to take their leave, as they drifted in ones and twos back down the path and across the fields and into their own kitchens where coffee steamed and bread crusted and a child's laugh might clean the smoke out of the air, was that Hinterkaifeck had just stepped into a long corridor of retellings. The small details, the straw, the dog, the keys, the stove's draft, the old woman's apron folded neatly on a chair, would be repeated so often that they would become like prayer beads, touched, counted, smoothed by the telling, and still unable to turn into answers. And in that slow drift of people away from the farm, with the first thin sunlight catching on the wet edges of footprints that led in from the trees and the absence of any leading back, the story placed itself firmly and forever on the side of things that do not resolve. The days after the discovery brought not closure, but more shadow. The police station in nearby Groburn found itself crowded with voices, some eager to help, others eager to be heard, still others cautious and clipped, as if afraid that speaking the wrong thing might draw the wrong kind of attention. The officers began the slow work of gathering what little could be called evidence from a place that had been walked through, touched, and stirred by dozens before they arrived. At Hinterkaifeck, the farm sat in uneasy stillness. The animals remained, tended now by neighbors and constables, their low breaths steaming in the chill mornings. The doors were latched, but never truly shut, Investigators came and went, journalists lingered, curious townsfolk drifted to the yard under one pretense or another. The wind through the trees made the same sound it always had, but now people noticed it, as if the farm's isolation were speaking out loud. The first theory was the most obvious to the practical minds of 1922 rural Germany. Robbery gone wrong. A stranger. Maybe a vagrant, maybe a desperate man from one of the war's many broken edges, comes to the farm, seeks money or valuables, is surprised, and kills to remove witnesses. But it didn't fit. Nothing of value was missing. Coins still lay in plain sight. Victoria's jewelry, modest but worth pawning, sat untouched. Even the locked boxes in the bedrooms had not been forced. The farm's livestock, tools, and provisions were intact. No robbery then. The idea of a targeted killing rose quickly after. Someone with a grievance, someone who knew the layout, the routines, the people. And when the talk turned that way, it wasn't long before fingers pointed toward the familiar. Andreas Gruber had not been well liked by everyone. Stories circulated, some whispered for years, others finding new life now that he was gone. The most damning was the long-standing rumor of incest between Andreas and Victoria. Court records confirmed that both had been convicted years earlier, serving short prison sentences for it, though neighbors debated whether Victoria had been a willing partner or a victim trapped by her father's dominance. If true, it meant tension in the family's relationships, particularly when Victoria sought companionship outside the farm. One name came up immediately. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a widower from the area, once rumored to be romantically involved with Victoria and possibly the father of little Joseph. Lorenz's behavior in the days after the murders drew scrutiny. He had been among the first to enter the property, helping to search and uncover the bodies. Some claimed he seemed oddly at ease, even feeding the animals and making remarks about the state of the house. Others said he was simply practical, doing what needed doing in a grim situation. Still, whispers took root. Why had he entered so quickly? How had he known the barn door could be opened a certain way? He explained that he had once been close to the family and knew the property well. As for Joseph, he admitted the possibility, but insisted Andreas had interfered in his relationship with Victoria. There was resentment there, some said visible in his eyes when he spoke of Andreas. But was it enough to kill 6 people, including children? The police could not decide. Then came the story of the stranger. Several locals recalled seeing a bearded man in the area in the days before the murders, someone they didn't recognize, walking the roads without purpose. One shopkeeper swore he had seen the man lingering near the forest path that led to Hinterkaifeck. But no one knew his name, and no one saw him after the murders. Was he real, or the invention of a community trying to shift suspicion away from its own? In the attic of the farmhouse, searchers found signs that someone might have been living there. Disturbed straw, footprints in the dust, a slight indentation where a man could have lain. The thought was chilling, that the intruder could have been inside for days, watching the family, learning their patterns, waiting. The strange noises Andreas had reported now seemed less like imagination and more like an unheeded warning. The murder weapon, a mattock, was eventually found hidden in the barn, its blade stained, the wood worn smooth by years of honest work, and now marked forever by violence. The fact that it belonged to the farm made investigators lean towards someone familiar with the place. A stranger might have brought his own weapon. This killer had not needed to. Forensics in 1922 offered little help. There were no fingerprints of value, no photographs detailed enough to catch what the eye had missed. The bodies, once examined, were buried quickly, though without their heads. Those were sent to Munich for further study. And there the story takes one of its strangest turns. Sometime before World War II, the heads vanished. Whether lost, destroyed, or hidden, no one could say. The official line was misplaced, but few believed it was an accident. As days turned to weeks, the investigation sprawled outward. More than 100 people were questioned. Dozens of theories were tested and discarded. The notion that the killer had stayed in the house, feeding the animals, eating the family's food, keeping the stove lit, remained the most disturbing and the most unexplained. What kind of person could move so easily from sudden, brutal murder to quiet, domestic caretaking? Some said it was the mark of a madman. Others said it was someone making sure the farm didn't draw attention before they could leave unnoticed. A few whispered a darker thought still. Perhaps it was someone who didn't see it as strange at all. Someone who thought they had simply taken over the life of the place, as if the old inhabitants had never existed. By the end of April, the trail was already cooling. The newspapers were losing interest, moving on to fresher scandals. The farm still stood, though its doors were shut tight, its windows blind. And somewhere in Bavaria, perhaps in a neighboring village, perhaps much farther away, the person who had done this was living among others, unnoticed, carrying the weight, or perhaps feeling nothing at all. In the years after the murders, Hinterkaifeck stopped being just a farm. It became a kind of ghost on the map, a place people could name without ever setting foot there. Parents warned children not to wander too far into the woods, and the name carried a faint chill even in broad daylight. Life in the nearby villages seemed to draw inwards, a quiet mixture of grief, suspicion, and the uneasy awareness that in rural places, the line between neighbor and stranger can be frighteningly thin. The investigation never truly ended, but it never got anywhere either. Files were reopened now and then, sparked by a deathbed confession here, a barroom boast there, or the sudden recollection of a witness who had kept silent for decades. But each time, the trail led nowhere. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, once close to the family, lived the rest of his life under the shadow of rumor, seen by some as a man unfairly suspected, by others as the only suspect who made sense. He never left the area, even returning to the site years later with journalists, casually demonstrating how the barn doors opened. To some, that showed openness. To others, familiarity only a killer could have. Over time, Hinterkaifeck drifted from case file to folklore. The strange details, the missing key, the attic noises, the footprints in the snow, became campfire staples. Stories blurred fact and imagination. A light seen in the barn at midnight, a shadow in the field days after the murders, a scream that was never explained. The farm was torn down in 1923, replaced by a simple memorial, but the absence only made the story stronger. Visitors still come to stand where the barn once stood, leaving flowers or just staring at the tree line. Writers, historians, and filmmakers return to the story again and again. It appeared in crime anthologies, documentaries, and even horror fiction. The elements were irresistible: an isolated farm, a family wiped out, and a killer who stayed to live among their ghosts. Even decades later, these details echo in modern retellings, sometimes in true crime works, sometimes in fictionalized forms that keep the bones of the case while inventing the rest. Today, Hinterkaifeck lives on not in soil or stone, but in the uneasy space between fact and legend. It's a story people still tell at night, lowering their voices at the part about the attic noises, glancing toward the window when they mention the footprints. Sometimes the most haunting stories are the ones that never find an ending. Thank you for listening to the story of the Hinterkaifeck murders, a case that has endured for more than a century, not because of what we know, but because of what we never will. If you found yourself drawn into this tale, find more captivating stories from the True Crime for Sleep series here. Good night, and may your dreams be quieter than the woods on a Bavarian winter's night.